Have you ever felt like some things just aren't resolved? That, no matter how hard you try to move on, something invisible keeps pulling your soul back to a place you'd rather never visit again. Well, there are some things time doesn't heal. It only hides. And when it hides poorly, that past begins to leak out, first in dreams, then in words, and finally in mirrors. We like to believe that everything is under control, that maturity is synonymous with overcoming. But what happens when overcoming is merely selective amnesia? Forgetting isn't forgiving. Ignoring isn't healing. And life, my friend, has a special way of giving you back exactly what you've avoided facing. Sooner or later, everyone has to face their true reflection. And it doesn't always smile back. That's what this story is about. Logan Myers was a renowned therapist, a man with a calm voice and an empathetic gaze, known for helping others deal with their deepest pain. But how do you deal with wounds you don't even know you have? When he returns to his hometown to care for his ailing mother, he believes he's merely closing a cycle. What he doesn't realize is that he's about to reopen a forgotten pact, made in silence, sealed by tragedy, and buried under the dust of denial. A note with no return address. A basement locked for nearly 2 decades. Reflections that whisper. Accusations, voices and recordings that belong to no one alive. And a child who should already be dead. All of this begins to collapse Logan's sense of himself, forcing him to see that his greatest patient has always been himself. And that, deep down, he never wanted to be cured, he just wanted to not remember. But forgetting has an expiration date, and when memory decides to awaken, it doesn't ask for permission. Logan's journey is a mirror for all of us. How many of us sweep guilt, decisions, regrets, versions of ourselves we're ashamed of under the rug? How far does your courage go when you're the one who needs to listen to yourself? This story is more than suspense, more than drama. It's an invitation to empathy, to humanity, to reconciliation with the parts of yourself you've abandoned along the way. Prepare yourself for an experience that blends emotion, fear, hope, pain, compassion, wisdom, and the kind of truth that cannot be ignored. Because sometimes, the past doesn't want forgiveness. It wants justice. And when that happens, you either run, or you finally decide to stay and listen to what the silence has been screaming for years. It was a cloudy afternoon when Logan Myers walked past the old, rusty sign that greeted those arriving in Maplewood. The gravel road seemed forgotten by time, but not by memory. There was something in the air of that town that seemed to speak to the soul, as if every corner whispered stories that were never fully told. Logan had left young, carried away by the weight of a silent guilt and a desire to restart his life, far from the shadows of the past. He became a respected therapist in New York, a specialist in emotional intelligence, known for his empathy and rare sensitivity. But no session he gave, no article he wrote, no conference he spoke at prepared him for what he felt as he crossed the wooden bridge at the city's entrance. The creaking of the boards sounded like an ancient lament. The trees, though still, seemed to watch him with the silent gaze of someone who knows too much. The smell, that unmistakable smell of rust and smoke, returned like a sharp blow. It was as if the ghosts of Maplewood were there, just waiting for his return. And in that inevitable reunion, Logan felt, for the first time in years, the bitter taste of unresolved loneliness. In his childhood home, everything seemed untouched, but nothing was the same. The furniture retained the scent of afternoons when his mother baked apple pies, and at the same time, the silence screamed memories that preferred to sleep. As he organized his mother's medication, now weakened by Alzheimer's, Logan realized that time had been cruel to everyone except the town's memory. Neighbors still whispered secrets behind their curtains. The church still rang its noon bell with somber punctuality. Even after so long, the scars of that tragic summer remained. It was in this emotional whirlwind that Logan realized something crucial. You can leave a town, But the town doesn't always leave you. It was as if Maplewood personified understanding itself. It didn't judge him, but it didn't free him either. There was affection there, yes, a kind of love hardened by time, by loss, by the shared fear of remembering too much. Returning to the town brought more than memories. It brought a reconnection with his rawest, most wounded, but also most honest humanity. And it was there, facing the cracked mirror in the old bathroom, that Logan understood. Life is a journey, there and back. But only the brave make it all the way. He had the courage of someone who faces their own ghosts with kindness, because he understood that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, comes not from denial, but from acceptance. This was the wisdom that so many years of therapy had tried to teach others, but which he himself had not yet fully practiced. The return to Maplewood was more than a filial obligation. It was a journey of reconciliation, a silent call from conscience, a chance to look into the eyes of his own youth and apologize. Each step through that city required perseverance, but also hope. And when he heard, that very night, the creaking of the bridge's wood echoing within his chest, he knew. The past didn't want punishment, it wanted to be heard. And this was just the beginning. The first morning the sun dared to touch the dusty stained glass windows of the old living room, Logan awoke with a strange sense of presence. It was as if someone were watching him while he dreamed, as if the house, in its aging structure, whispered that he wasn't as alone as he'd imagined. As he walked to the front door, stepping slowly over the familiar creaks of the floorboards, he saw something that made his stomach churn. An envelope, yellowed with age, rested under the threshold. His name was handwritten in a script that seemed to have come from another life. No return address, no address, just Logan. As he opened it, the words struck him like an unauthorized reminder. I'm still here. You promised to keep the secret. The handwriting was strangely familiar. But the most terrifying thing wasn't what was written, but who supposedly had written it. Someone who, by all accounts, had been dead for 17 years. And not just dead, but buried beneath layers of silence, fear, and a promise that should never have been made. The letter acted like a rusty key that, nevertheless, unlocked the wrong door. Logan spent the rest of the day in a state of lucid confusion, where the past began to blend into the present like mist over a lake. A therapist's mind, trained to organize memories and feelings, was now a labyrinth. He began to question everything, his sanity, his honesty, his own version of the story. There, the yellowed paper became a symbol of something greater, that the truth, no matter how buried, has the inconvenient gift of always resurfacing. Searching for answers, he searched through old notebooks, diaries, any clue that connected him to that promise. Nothing. But the letter was there, demanding more than understanding, demanding action. And it was at that moment that Logan felt, for the first time, that perhaps he was being watched. As if that phrase, "I'm still here," was more than symbolic. As if that someone had never truly left. The words of the letter, repeated in his mind, not only rekindled his fear, but revealed the fragility of human memory. And therein lies a profound lesson. Our minds sometimes choose to erase what they cannot bear. Denial may seem like a temporary solution, but it exacts its price in the form of loneliness, guilt, and insecurity. Logan knew this. He even taught it in his office. But there, within the storm itself, he learned that applying wisdom is much more arduous than professing it. The letter was a brutal invitation to revision, to revisit, to reconcile with what had been forgotten out of necessity. And even without knowing how or why, he understood. There was more to come. That note wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a dangerous game where truth, trust, and sanity itself were at stake. And when night fell, he could barely sleep. Every creak in the house seemed to carry voices. Voices that told him that what was buried no longer slept. During his third night in Maplewood, Logan was awakened by a sound that sounded like a calling from deep within the house. A low, almost imperceptible, yet insistent noise, as if something or someone were banging on the inside of the walls. The sound came from the basement, the same one he had avoided since his teens. The door remained locked with an old, rusty padlock his father had installed after that summer. His heart raced, but there was something stronger than fear. The need to understand. With trembling hands and shallow breathing, Logan picked the padlock with a wrench he found in the garage. The door creaked like a throat that had not spoken for a long time. The smell of mold, dust, and rust hit him like a blow. He descended the creaking steps with his flashlight in hand, each step heavier than the last. Down below, a silence as thick as darkness enveloped him, and his eyes found what time had left behind. The basement was a dark altar of unresolved memories. In one corner, an old broken mirror reflected distortions that seemed to mock reality. Cloths covered antique furniture, and on the wooden floor, inscriptions written in shaky, childish chalk. "You said you'd never tell." The phrase throbbed in his mind like a war drum. The room seemed to pulse, not physically, but energetically. The compassion he had for others now needed to be applied to himself. The guilt returned with force, like a child crying in the dark. For forgiveness. Familiar objects lay in the corner, the red lantern he used for camping, the jacket he swore he'd lost, a cassette tape marked with an X. Each item stirred memories. Muffled screams, the sound of running footsteps, a pact sealed under the weight of youth and fear. The basement was the hidden heart of the house, and of Logan's past. It was where it all began, or perhaps where it all ended. The images that emerged were fragmented like broken dreams, but there was consistency in the sensations. The cold he felt didn't come from the environment, it came from his soul. The memory of the scream that night, the fall of someone he'd never had the courage to help, the pleading look of a friend, it all came back, mixed with the certainty that he had failed. Logan fell to his knees there, feeling the weight of humanity and vulnerability in their rawest form. The emotional intelligence he so prized now needed to give way to humility, to the acceptance of pain, to the wisdom that not everything can be fixed, but everything can be faced. That basement wasn't just a physical space. It was an internal reflection, the mirror of his divided mind. And as the words written in chalk slowly disappeared beneath his tears, he knew that from then on, each night would bring not only memories, but new callings. Because those who open the door to the past can hardly close it again. It was during a walk down Maplewood's main street that Logan spotted something that chilled his blood. On the bench in front of the old ice cream shop where he spent his summer afternoons sat Samantha Crowley. Same floral blouse, same light laugh, same sparkle in her eyes. She seemed to have not aged a single day since the last time he saw her, 17 years ago. His head spun. It didn't make sense. Samantha was dead. He knew it. He was at the wake, he gave her mother flowers, he cried with the others. And yet, there she was, as if time had paused only to mock logic. With a serene smile and eyes filled with something between sweetness and alertness, she said, "Are you still afraid of getting caught?" It was more than a sentence, it was a trigger. The words pierced the barrier of denial like a well-aimed arrow, touching a point in Logan's mind that had long since silenced. They walked side by side for a few blocks, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Samantha talked about school, about her teachers, about the plans they'd made when they were too young to understand the consequences of promises. And then she was gone. She simply vanished when he looked away for a moment. No trace, no explanation. The next day, overcome with unease, Logan tried to locate her. He searched records, called old acquaintances, and finally went to the cemetery. There she was, her headstone covered in dry leaves. Samantha Elaine Crowley, born in 1991, died in 2008. Doubt swept through him like a current. Was it a hallucination brought on by stress? Or was there something more? Something that only a deep understanding of the human soul could explain? The mind can hide memories, yes, but what if it also recreates them to protect itself from pain? Samantha's visit was a cruel reminder that not everything that is forgotten is, in fact, overcome. The episode with Samantha lit something inside Logan, a beacon of anguish but also a warning. He began to understand that his mind, once his most powerful tool, might now be his own prison. The visit from his deceased friend wasn't just a paranormal event or an illusion. It was, above all, a call to truth. A truth that cried out for reconciliation, for altruism, for the courage to face the unbearable, that which had been voluntarily erased from memory. How many parts of his history had been buried with excuses? How many traces of his youth were hidden under layers of rationalization? Memory is a treacherous trap. It protects, yes, but it also limits. And sometimes, the strongest form of kindness one can practice toward oneself is to confront what was left behind. It was then that Logan understood. True healing comes not from forgetting, but from full acceptance, from sincere listening. And as he sat back down on the same bench where he had seen Samantha, the wind whispered, "There is someone else wanting to be remembered." Faced with the growing chaos of his memories and the thin line between reality and delirium, Logan decided to turn to what he knew best, therapy. Only this time he wouldn't be the conductor, but the patient himself. He installed a small camera in his room, sat in front of it as he did with his clients, and began recording self-analysis sessions. The proposal seemed sensible, to use his knowledge to process the trauma, find answers, and restore confidence. At first, the videos revealed a tired but still rational man. His speeches addressed fear, insecurity, and guilt. However, as he reviewed the files, something disconcerting happened. There were voices in the recordings, voices that weren't his. Voices that answered. Voices that asked questions. And one, in particular, whispered with a timbre that seemed to come from within the walls. "You were once the patient. We just watched." The sensation was like being punched in the chest. Reason, his last refuge, was being eroded. Logan obsessively reviewed the recordings, searching for technical glitches, external noise, any plausible explanation. But nothing justified the clarity of those words. The most frightening thing was that the voices knew details only those involved in the accident knew. Things never told to anyone. Situations he himself had tried to bury. It was as if his mind, or something beyond it, was rebelling against silence. And herein lies one of the hardest lessons of the human soul. The truth cannot be silenced through the force of denial. Logan realized that his suffering was not merely psychological, it was existential. He wasn't just dealing with memories. He was facing manifestations of his own wounded consciousness. Those sessions became rituals of extreme emotional exposure, where self-compassion had to overcome shame and panic. And when the voice whispered again, "You're not ready yet," he understood. Healing requires time, humility, and above all, absolute honesty. It was at this point that Logan began to question his own identity. Who was he, after all, beyond the memories he chose to preserve? And who was that hidden version that seemed to emerge in the videos, full of pain and anger, but also truth? It was as if he had been split in two, the therapist who knew how to guide and the lost young man who begged for salvation. This duality exposed the essence of what it means to be human, the constant battle between what we show and what we hide. The power of kindness he had so cultivated with others now needed to be directed at this wounded self that lived in the shadows. The solution was not to erase the voices, but to listen to them with empathy, with courage. It was time to collaborate with his own mind, no longer to fight against it. Because, deep down, all trauma is a cry for attention. And as he pressed play on the next recording, Logan realized perhaps the answers weren't coming from him, but Through him, mirrors had always been neutral objects for Logan until they stopped acting as they should. It all started with small delays in the reflection. He would turn his face, and for a split second, his image would remain still, as if it had a life of its own. At first, he thought he was exhausted, his mind overwhelmed. But as the days progressed, the phenomenon became impossible to ignore. One day, as he passed the hallway mirror, he saw something, or rather someone behind him, a shadow, a motionless figure. When he turned quickly, nothing was there. From that moment on, he avoided mirrors. He covered some with sheets, turned others to the wall, but he knew he was only postponing the inevitable, because mirrors didn't just reflect, now they accused. And on one particularly quiet night, he saw his younger reflection, covered in blood, eyes wide, staring back at him. And then, the words, "You pushed him." The reflected figure wore a jacket Logan never remembered owning. It was navy blue, with a torn sleeve and dark stains. The next day, driven by a mixture of dread and need, he went to the basement. He rummaged through forgotten corners, through dusty boxes, until he found an old plastic bag, taped shut. Inside, the jacket. The same one, and yes, with dried blood on the sleeve. Reality hit him with the force of a hurricane. Either he had purposefully erased that memory, or he had never truly wanted to remember. And it was at this point that wisdom mixed with pain, realizing that the human mind not only stores, but edits, alters, protects, and betrays. The reflection was no longer an ordinary mirror. It was a silent witness. The understanding Logan sought in books, in patience, in sessions, now came from his own reflection, showing that sometimes the answer you seek is staring you right in the eye. Or in the eyes of what you used to be. The mirrors then became portals, not in the mystical sense, but as living metaphors for internal division. They didn't show what was, but what was denied. And the most terrifying thing is that, as he stared at his bloodied reflection, Logan felt something he hadn't expected. Familiarity. There wasn't just fear. There was acceptance. A strange form of affection for that version of himself that carried the weight of unconscious decisions. Because even the most devastating mistakes are part of who we are. And ignoring them is an act of cowardice disguised as self-preservation. The figure in the mirror didn't demand forgiveness, but justice. And that hurt. It was forced resignification. The reunion with the raw, unvarnished truth. Logan understood that, to move forward, he would have to stop running from himself. And in each mirror he stared into, there was less fear and more acceptance, more courage, more humanity. But also more questions in an attempt to reorganize his routine and find some peace of mind. Logan decided to clean out the bookshelf in his father's old office. Dusty books, overdue bills, newspaper clippings, everything seemed ordinary until something fell from the top of the shelf. It was a hand-bound, black-covered journal. As he leafed through it, he noticed something utterly disturbing. It was filled with notes written in his own handwriting. The dates ranged from 2006 to 2007. Each page seemed to plunge deeper, into a darkness he couldn't remember experiencing. At first, he thought it was an old notebook of sketches or rants, but when he read phrases like, "Today I managed to make them believe," or "She threatened to tell," "I had to act," the air seemed to drain from the room. It was impossible. He would never write that. Or would he? When the mind fragments, even sincerity becomes a labyrinth. And Logan now found himself at the center of this maze, where the only way out was to confront what he feared most. Himself. The descriptions in the text weren't just vague details, but detailed accounts of emotional manipulation, intimidation, even possible threats. The words held anger, fear, and a certain dark pleasure. Logan felt nauseous. That part of him that had always preached empathy, respect, and emotional intelligence collapsed at phrases like, "They would do anything to feel accepted. I just had to show them the way." It was an unfamiliar Logan, a reflection of a mind under stress, perhaps dissociated, perhaps shrouded in denial. The scariest thing was realizing that on some level, everything made sense. It was as if the diary were the voice of a hidden, dormant, but real part of him. A voice he'd ignored for over a decade. The duality between therapist and manipulator imploded all certainties. There was no longer room for innocence. All that remained was the courage to rebuild with compassion, yes, but without escaping the truth. And it was on the last page that Logan found the sentence that broke what remained of his resistance. If they find out ... you go back there. The message had the power of a prophecy and the weight of a sentence. There wasn't a geographical location. It was a state of mind. A return to inner darkness, to the cruelest isolation. The one where one's own conscience becomes a jailer. From that moment on, Logan realized that his life had always been divided in two. The part that wanted to heal and the part that never accepted being hurt. The diary, with its pages marked by old tears and words as sharp as razors, was the bridge between these two worlds. It was the living reminder that every human being is capable of greatness, but also of profound flaws. That it is in brutal honesty, with our shadows, that the true initiative for change is born. And there, with trembling fingers and wet eyes, Logan understood. The next clue wouldn't come from the pages, it would come from silence. And perhaps from the one he thought he would never see again. On that cloudy morning, Logan needed air. His head throbbed with the weight of recent revelations. He decided to walk through the ancient woods that bordered the school where he studied. The place, once a symbol of adventure and youthful freedom, now had a melancholy, somber quality. As he followed the trail of dry leaves, he spotted something that made him stop in his tracks. A girl. She stood, motionless, at the edge of the woods. Her eyes were blindfolded with a white bandage, holding an unlit flashlight. Her presence seemed displaced from time, as if she belonged to another plane, another cycle. Logan called out, but she didn't answer. He approached slowly, fearing that any sudden movement would make her disappear. When he was a few steps away, the child reached out and handed him a note. It was written in childish handwriting, its lines shaky. "You promised I'd come back." And then, without warning, she ran into the woods and vanished like mist. Logan tried to follow, but it was like running in circles within his own fear. Back home, the note weighed heavily in his hands as if it were made of lead. He mentally replayed every detail, every word spoken, every promise he couldn't remember making. The next day, determined to find out who that child was, he rummaged through boxes of old school photos. And that was when his heart nearly stopped. In a picture taken during a third-grade performance, there she was. The same face, the same haircut. The name, Diane Sanders, the younger sister of one of the accident victims. She was only 9 years old. And most disturbingly, no one had ever mentioned that she too was in the woods that night. The pieces began to fit together with a quiet ache. The child's innocence contrasted with the gravity of the message. Diane represented the forgotten. Part of the tragedy, the one that wasn't evident, but that carried the echo of the suffering of the families, the survivors, those left behind. The innocent pain, the one that demands understanding but finds no answers. And there, Logan understood that there was something beyond himself in all of this. That what he faced wasn't just a personal trauma, but a collective one. That the pain of an entire city was, somehow, being reflected in him. Diane was a symbol of this, the interrupted purity, the shattered hope, the price of silence. It was also a call to accountability. It was no longer about seeking forgiveness. It was about offering reparation. Remembering the blindfolded girl in the woods forced him to reflect on the power of kindness and altruism. What could he do now? How could he transform all of this into something that at least made sense? Perhaps the answer lay in small actions. Visiting Diane's mother, restoring the girl's memory, seeking silent justice. Because sometimes the strongest form of love is restoring dignity to what has been forgotten. And Logan, holding the note in his hands again, realized the flashlight was off, but not for long. That night, the storm arrived without warning, as if the sky decided to join in on Logan's emotional turmoil. Thunder ripped through the silence, and lightning briefly illuminated the walls of his room. He fell asleep exhausted, but what followed wasn't sleep, it was an invitation. He dreamed of the gymnasium of his old school, the bleachers shrouded in shadows, the stage illuminated by a pale light. And there, one by one, all his former classmates were present. Face by face, everyone involved directly or indirectly in the tragic accident. But no one said a word. They stood motionless like statues of flesh and soul, all staring at him. The silence was more violent than any scream. A silence charged with guilt, expectation, judgment. Logan tried to speak, but his voice faltered. He tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. That meeting wasn't a dream, it was a confrontation. It was a demand. It was the understanding of the dead demanding a gesture from the living. When Logan woke, he wasn't just sweaty or scared. He was wet. His clothes were caked with mud, and in his hand, something impossible. An old-school theater ticket. Printed. On it in faded ink was the exact date of the accident. It was as if time had collapsed in on itself, as if the past was finally crossing the border of memory to forcefully touch the present. Once again, he found himself faced with the question he'd avoided most. What really happened that night? The ticket wasn't just a physical object, it was a symbol. It represented the appointed hour, the moment of choice, the turning point. It was a reminder that everything unresolved returns. And with greater intensity, the figures watching him in the dream, those speechless expressions, demanded more than an apology. They demanded action, justice, truth. It was the culmination of collective grief, a call to reconciliation that involved not only memory, but consequences. And then the inevitable question arose. What if the real nightmare wasn't in what Logan had done, but in what he chose not to remember? That meeting in the gymnasium, so vivid and symbolic, made him understand that denying one's own history is not an act of protection, but of slow destruction. By avoiding confronting his mistakes, he had allowed the shadows to grow. Now each silent face that night represented a part of himself that required courage, initiative, emotional intelligence. It was time to stop running, to stop avoiding. The dead, real or metaphorical, were gathered not to condemn, but to invite. To invite truth, to liberation. And Logan, as he held the ticket one last time before placing it on the table, knew the next page would hold no more mysteries. Bringing light meant facing the last darkness. And that light, however faint, was already beginning to emerge. It was morning when Logan sat in front of the bathroom mirror, now clean, unlatched, uncovered. There was nowhere left to run. The notes, the voices, the reflections, the visitors, everything converged on a single point. The truth. And she no longer knocked on the door. She had already entered. As he watched her tired face, aged by pain and discovery, flashes began to invade his mind with a piercing clarity. He remembered, not fragments, but everything. He remembered the plan to scare a colleague. He remembered the push, the fall, the blood, the desperation, and the cowardly decision to remain silent. He manipulated others. He created a narrative and swore never to tell. It was a weight his mind decided to carry in pieces, because in one piece, it would be unbearable. But now he was whole. Whole in pain, yes, but also whole in truth. And that changed everything. In that moment, Logan knew that forgiving himself wasn't enough. Forgiveness is a balm, but it is no substitute for justice. Because true love, the kind that transforms, is born of responsibility. He could no longer hide behind the kindness he offered, his patience, the beautiful words about resilience and hope. It was time to apply everything he preached to himself. Initiative, honesty, altruism. He got up, went to the basement, grabbed the diary, the jacket, and the girl's note. He organized everything in a box and headed to the local police station. There, he asked to speak to someone. He told his story. All of it. There was no longer any fear, only an intense desire to honor those who were gone, and those who still lived with the invisible scars of what happened. Sometimes the past doesn't want our remorse. It wants our action. It wants our courage. It wants us to be big enough to admit we failed, and yet we want to do right. But before he left the house that morning, something happened. Logan walked down the hallway and, without meaning to, glanced at the mirror. And the mirror, smiled, not with lips, but with presence. The reflection was clean, calm, at peace, as if that young, bloodied version had been heard and freed. The greatest wisdom Logan discovered wasn't about trauma, but about reconciliation. The deepest form of empathy is recognizing that even our most flawed selves deserve to be heard. His mind, once a battlefield, was now fertile ground for rebuilding. Because true healing doesn't happen when we forget, but when we choose to remember with purpose. And as he walked out the door, breathing the fresh maplewood air, Logan understood that this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. And somewhere behind every tree, every shadow, every memory, a new story was already beginning to be written. If there's one thing Logan's story teaches us, it's that as frightening as revisiting the past is, avoiding it doesn't make it go away. Untreated trauma becomes silent, open wounds. And many of us carry these scars as if they were shameful secrets, when in reality, they are the beginning of a conversation we haven't yet had with ourselves. So if you too feel like you're carrying an old burden, something that holds you back, paralyzes you, prevents you from moving forward, know you're not alone, and you don't have to face this without support. Seeking professional help isn't a sign of weakness. It's an act of courage. Therapy, support groups, listening circles, even the simple act of writing a journal with brutal honesty can begin to illuminate parts of your history that have been forgotten but unhealed. You can start small. Set aside 10 minutes of your day to jot down stray thoughts. Write a letter without sending it to the version of yourself that suffered. Speak to it with care, with affection, with kindness. Give voice to the part of you that has never been heard. Listen, really, and if you feel like you can't, seek out someone who knows how to conduct this listening with empathy and wisdom. A psychologist, a support group, a spiritual mentor, someone you trust. Healing begins the moment you decide to stop hiding. And more important than reliving what happened is rebuilding what you want to experience from now on. The past explains, but it doesn't determine. And you have the right and the duty to imagine yourself free, to reclaim your self-esteem, your initiative, your courage, to redefine your narrative. Because you are more than what hurt you, and if all of this has touched you, take a deep breath now and absorb this truth. You can. You can rebuild. You can change. You can be happy, even with a heavy past. Healing is possible. Reconciliation is possible. Self-love is possible. What happened to you is part of the story, not the end of it. So I ask you, what will you do with all this you carry? Will you continue to blame yourself, or will you turn this pain into a starting point? Leave a comment. What part of this story spoke to you? Let's talk together. Share this video with someone you know who needs to hear this message. And of course, if this content inspired you, if it helped you see life through different eyes, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications. Because there's still so much to live, so much to learn, so much to heal. And you don't have to do it alone. We're here to remind you that the past may scream, but you're the one who decides the ending.